How's it going, informatics professionals? We're now on part 1, section 2 of 8 total lectures. Let's go ahead and get started on installing Flutter and start onto our computer. So flutter.dev is a website you're going to go to. This web page may update because, well, timing, but usually there's going to be a getting started and it'll tell you based on whatever version, Windows, Mac, OS X, or Linux you're actually using. Here's the Cliff Notes. This is all the stuff you're going to download. They're pretty big. I recommend using Visual Studio Code, though you can do all your development in Android Studio. I'm going to be showing you it in VS Code. And you will either need to set up an Android or an iOS emulator. Step by step, these instructions are very important. There is one thing that can be variable and a little bit of a pain with regards to your path, and so I will focus on that just a little bit. But a good rule of thumb is if you can run Flutter Doctor, it'll actually tell you what you still need. The only exception to this rule is when we say deploy to iOS devices. I'm ignoring those steps for now. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So here's the flutter.dev website. I'm going to click Get Started, which you can also get to under Docs. Keep in mind now they actually have the ability to install on Chrome OS, which is nice. And we could do this in Finder, but I'm actually going to do this in Terminal because I think that will work regardless of what you're using. And I am actually just going to show you something called echo path. Whenever you run any commands, they're actually found in here. And the reason why we're trying to update our path down the road is so that we can make Flutter a command you can run from any directory. So that's why that's important. If I followed this directly where I just did cd/development, it's going to fail because I don't actually have that file. And if you look, I'm actually already in my home directory anyway. So I can just make directory development. And now this will work. Okay, next one, unzip and home directory to downloads to Flutter. Pressing tab will automatically bring all of that stuff in. Okay, so if you're ever running into problems, you open a new bash shell or a new shell in Terminal and then just type this in from where we are right here, and it should allow you to use the Flutter commands directly. But the right way to do this permanently is from this part, which is upgrading your path. And I'm going to tell you that the version of Mac OS that you have, which you can get to from up here, matters because Mojave is still using Bash and Catalina, the next version, is going to use ZSH by default. Personally, I use Fish, so I don't even bother with this, but you have to update your path in any one of these. So I need to edit my home directory, so I'm going to go back to my home directory. If you're ever confused, you can press or type in print working directory, and that shows my username for this account. And now I'm going to edit a .bashrc, and if I just type in open .bashrc, that's not going to work because it doesn't exist. Touch is a nice command to create a brand new file that has nothing in it. And the next step, add this to the line and replace this with the path to Flutter directory. There's a few ways you could do this. You could actually type in ~home, or you can just type in or the actual tilde. I'm just going to do this and development because that's where we put it. And if I hit save and then I do echo path, it still doesn't work. The reason for that is because I haven't actually sourced that bashrc file. Now keep in mind that every time a terminal opens, it will source whatever files are actually there. So if I close it and then I go up to shell and just do new window, echo path, it's still not there. Well, in Bash, by default, it only reads these files. And so it's not actually sourcing the .bashrc that we literally just made. So I'm going to, per this recommendation, just go to the _profile, and I'm going to add source .bashrc. And I need this to be lowercase, and I'm going to close it. If I close this tab and then reopen, now it finally has Flutter/bin. So now if I type in Flutter Doctor, it'll run. That's important. I wish these steps actually showed you that a little bit more. If you're running into troubles, this will always work if you're starting in the the folder for cd/development, assuming that's where you've unzipped. That's where you've unzipped the Flutter document. Okay, now moving on. We just ran Flutter Doctor, and I want to actually see what it's done. Okay, so it hasn't found the Android SDK. It wants me to install Android Studio. And I need to accept or initialize CocoaPods. And I have to make sure that all of these things are already set up. Okay, so I already did the update your path. I'm going to just copy this part from Xcode. And I have to type in my password. Oh, okay. I can't do sudo on this. Give me 1 second. So actually for this part, I already have Xcode installed, and I ran this on my primary account. So I had that ahead of time. So you can't actually run sudo if you're using this as a member. What I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to do Flutter Doctor. And it wants me to install Android Studio. Once I have that, I'll set the Android SDK, and it wants me to do pod space setup. And let's see if that works. Next part is opening a simulator. Let's see if that actually works while this whole thing downloads. And then we will create a brand new app. Okay, we're back. CocoaPods has just run right here. So that it says update is available, but I can't do that because I'm right now on a dummy account so that I can do these training. Let's just type in open -a simulator and see if we get, yes we do, cool. While that is starting for the first time on this account, I will show you the next part. So create and run a simple Flutter app. This is the hello world that you will see by default. So Flutter, create, and we're going to call this Flutter4CME, all lowercase. And this will be the one that we use for the rest of this session. And it wants me to change directory into my app, so cd space Flutter4CME, and I'm going to type in Flutter run, and hopefully I'll have my hello world set up. Now I mentioned the deploy to iOS devices while this is happening. That part is not useful for us right now unless you are actually putting this on an iPhone. If you're just running in an emulator, you don't actually have to have an iOS developer account. So I'm skipping this. And the Android Studio parts are also going to be important. I will already have Android Studio installed. I just haven't run it for the first time. So I'll let that run in the background while this application is running for the first time. Let's do a custom location. That's fine. Oop, doesn't want me to. Okay, so I won't import settings. That's fine. And this is continuing to compile the Flutter resource while Android Studio is installing. As you're working your way down, if you're actually wanting to put this on a Android phone, you can do that without any difficulty at all. If you're on Windows, you'll need a driver for that though. All right, so the Xcode build is done. And let's see, there we go. We have a Hello World app. we have this running in terminal directly. So I haven't even installed or opened Android Studio for the first time or VS Code at this point. But we have everything there, all created just directly from the terminal. I'll get Android Studio up and running and VS Code up and running, and then I will walk you through a couple of these steps on Windows. Okay, so Android Studio is up for the first time. It wants to update. I'm going to just skip that for the time being. I'm just going to do standard settings. Let's make everything dark. I think that looks better. It's going to download a gig of data onto my computer, so I'm going to pause the video while all this is happening. Okay, so Android Studio has downloaded for the first time, and really all we need for this is that we want to set up an emulator for Nexus. And to get to there, I'm just going to click through a new project because it's going to be a little bit easier to get to that actual AVD manager, as you see on the Setup Android emulator. You know, things change, tech changes, and I say that it's important to follow each step line by line, but if you actually looked at tools, there is no longer an Android AVD manager. And as you kind of skim through each of these, you still don't see it. I'm going to show you the little trick, at least in this time of October 2019. This little icon right here is the other way that you can get to Android Virtual Device Manager. I'm going to click through Nexus, and I'm just going to have it download Pi, which is the current stable version, and click Accept. Okay, so now that's installed. What you can do is within Android Studio, you now see that we have a Nexus emulator that we can run just by pressing that play button. Let's see if it actually works. And there it is. And so this was how I was able to have both an iOS and an Android emulator at the same time. And what will be next is I will show you how to get started with Visual Studio Code. So we're done with Android Studio right now. Okay, so we know we have two separate emulators that we can run whenever we need. The last bit I'm going to do is I'm going to open Visual Studio Code and show you which things that you should have set up on there for the first time. This is the first time I've run Visual Studio Code, so I don't have any plugins or anything actually set up. I will show you these extensions, and this will be the primary editor that we're using. So where it says set up an editor, I'm skipping Android Studio. We're just going to, I already have this downloaded and installed. And you need to absolutely have to have the Flutter extension, but I'll show you a few others that I would suggest as well. Let's go ahead and go to where it has extensions. This is this icon, Flutter, and click Install. The other ones that I would suggest, at least at this point while we're working through this, anytime you have any sort of Flutter snippets, it will allow you to start typing in some of the code, like for stateless widgets and stateful widgets, which you'll learn about. And this one also I really like as well. The others are just to make your job a little bit easier. You have, if you've never heard of GetLens, you need it, assuming you're doing anything in a version controlled environment, aka on Git or GitHub. Brackets are very important in Flutter, and so the thing that actually sets them all to be the exact same, like different colors, I think is pretty helpful. Better comments, I would just recommend. It's a nice way that you can, as you're commenting your own work, add some extra things like question marks and things like that, and that'll change the color. Not a requirement. Same thing with this one, where you are able to use a keyboard shortcut to add a semicolon at the end of your line. That makes it behave a little bit closer to what Android Studio does. Material icon theme, I'm a fan of. You don't have to have this, but I do. I just like the icons for material design. And the last thing that I will suggest is going to be PubSpec Assist. And feel free to pause as you're going through each one, but I'll have this list of all of them open up here in a second. PubSpec is how you are able to get whatever dependencies you need for Flutter. So now that all of that is done, let's see which ones I've actually installed. Okay, so when you click at the three dots here, you can actually show the ones that I have installed. So awesome Flutter snippets and Flutter widget snippets. Better comments if you like that. Bracket pair colorizer. Dart and Flutter are the only ones that you absolutely have to need. Material icon if you like the way that material design looks. And pub spec assist to make your job easier if you're ever actually putting in additional dependencies. Those are the ones that I think are the highest yield when you're working on Flutter in Visual Studio Code. Okay, so just for the sake of brevity on this video, I will at least show you a couple of things on the Windows version that are unique to this installation, but overall it is pretty similar. You download the SDK, you extract it to wherever you want. Just for this, I put it in c:/src/flutter. And then when you update your path, you just have to press Start, ENV, and then press Enter. And then you change your environment variables. If you're doing this for just your user, you'll update this path, but if you want it for all users, you have to update this path. And you just click here, and in a new spot is where you would actually type this in. I already typed it in at this part. And it just has to be whatever location you had, c:/src/flutter/ben. And then when you run Flutter Doctor, and you have to do that in PowerShell, it should give you all of the parts that you need. I already had Android Studio installed on here, and I've already accepted the licenses it needed, so now it should run just fine in a Windows environment as well. Okay, at this point, you should have a Flutter SDK installed, be you on Mac or Windows. You should also have Android Studio, mostly so that you can get an emulator. If you're on Mac, you'll also have Xcode and an iOS emulator. And you should have Visual Studio Code with the correct plugins and extensions installed. You should be able to open an Android or iOS emulator together. And be you on Mac or Windows, you should have your path updated so that if you're in Terminal or in PowerShell, running Flutter Doctor from any directory will work. Now, let's go into the Hello World app. And I showed it a little bit while we were installing on Mac, just following from the flutter.dev instructions. And I'll show you a separate way to do the Hello World app. In the terminal, the way we did this was we had typed in Flutter create my app, and then we went into whatever that directory was, and we ran it in Flutter. We had an emulator open, and then we typed Flutter space run. If you go to the Flutter website and just getting started, and let's just click over to test drive, that is exactly what we did. If you want to see how to do this in Visual Studio Code, then it will tell you exactly what steps to do. So within the command palette, type in new project, and then we name the app. That's it. So let's type in code, and the command palette, the shortcut for this is Command Shift and P. It's a really, really, really useful shortcut to have. So let's type in new project, and let's call this Flutter4CME. And the original one that we had, I'm actually going to get rid of. So we'll just delete that and we'll put it in the exact same space. Let's go to development, Flutter4CME. This is where it was. Now we're going to create a new one. And we're going to put this in the same location. The other thing that is helpful with this command palette is if you want to launch an emulator, you can do that. It will launch it whenever Flutter Create has completed. So let's open an Android emulator. Let's go back over here and launch the iOS emulator. So now we have both Android and iOS emulators running at the same time. If you ever want to switch between which one is going to run whenever you press play or debug, you can figure that out down here at the bottom right corner. That's how you switch. If you want this to run on both at the same time, you have to do that in a terminal, be it within Visual Studio Code or just a separate terminal. Personally, I use iTerm, and I have great keyboard shortcuts for that, and that is very helpful for me. So I'm going into the directory that is here. That is also what you see in this part. That is the folder structure. And if I type in Flutter -d all for actually, if you want to see Flutter devices, it'll tell you which ones we have. We have the Android and we have the iPhone. And so now if I type in Flutter run -d all, it's going to compile this for the first time on both at the same time, and then you should be able to see them run. Now, since this is the first time this has ever compiled, it will take a little bit of extra time, and while that's happening, I'll just tell you that what I'm doing is literally the exact same as me clicking up here and clicking Start Debugging. The only difference is that I'm now running it on both in the exact same place. If I was only running this on one just by Start Debugging and I make some changes and I press save, it will do hot reload all at once, and it will just immediately know the second I press save, it will make those changes. But since I am doing this on both and I'm running this in a console, I have to press R, lowercase, after I've made these changes so that I can see it update on both. This is the reason why I would suggest, if you're actually making all this code, just use one emulator at a time. It's faster. But I just want to show you how I was able to do this whenever from the example that I showed earlier. And as we were watching that XKCD comic, this takes time. This isn't fast. And that's okay. After we get this whole part up and running, everything else, every time we make these changes, is going to be sub-second updates. So now you see that I have a Hello World app running on both Android and iPhone at the same time. And if I change the title of this as an example to Flutter4CME, and then I press save, it doesn't update. But if I go over to terminal and I just press R, then you can actually see how it's updated on both. We'll take a very brief break here. I'm going to show you what the Barebones app is, and then from here on out we will run everything all in VS Code with just one emulator so that it will actually make those changes in real time and we don't actually have to press R each time in the terminal. Okay, so if you are actually wondering what the bare minimum of an app is, well, again, we can find this on flutter.dev as we go through the app structure. The answer is Material App, and mostly because that's all of the convenience widgets and things that you need to get everything started. If you actually go up to get flutter.dev, docs, and then widget catalog, it will tell you a whole lot of really useful information about the basics, everything you can interact with, and beyond. Just to show you where it exists, under Material and then Material App tells you everything you would want to know about how to set each part within Material App. But I'm just going to take what's already running, and we don't need the stuff that's commented out. We don't need literally any of this. So from this whole stateful widget all the way down, I'm just going to delete that. And this part that says home, I'm going to delete that too. And I'm going to use a snippet to say hello world. Let's just call this Barebones. And you know what, while we're at it, let's just hit save there. And I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to comment this out. All you have is a Material App with a little bit of text. And as I press R here, it says Barebones. That is the absolute minimum thing you need. Import package flutter material.dart, void main, run this app, one stateless widget with Material App, and that's it. Everything we build in the next few sections will start from here.